Ledger is a writing podcast, and if you plan to write today, turn to the next page. I'm your host, Austin Wilson. Welcome to today's show where I chat with Rana Tahir. She is the author of 2 different Choose Your Own Adventure novels, including Heroes and Monsters, the Stranger Things Choose Your Own Adventure novel that is set in Season 4. She also wrote one in the SPIES series about Noor Inayat Khan, an actual spy. And we talk about the differences between writing those 2 things, but also we talk about what it's like to write a Choose Your Own Adventure novel. And from my perspective, it looks insanely freaking hard. So yeah, if you ever wondered what goes into creating those narratives that branch and are based on where you, the reader, take the story by turning to certain pages, we get into that. We get into how she has to write a single storyline all the way through and then go back and write another storyline all the way through and then piece it all together, and obviously with the help of editors and stuff. So very interesting. I grew up reading Choose Your Own Adventure novels and was super, super excited to find out how exactly they come into being. Rana is also a poet, so we talk about all kinds of things surrounding poetry, whether they have beginning, middles, and ends. We do talk about what it's like to write in second person, which is what the Choose Your Own Adventure novels are written in. We talk about Scrivener, a program that both Rana and I love. Oh gosh, Harry Styles fan-fic, whether the character of Robin from Stranger Things is tall. You even get to see or hear a performance of some early poetry from Rana Tahir, who did in fact at one point hate poetry. So because she's published a lot of poetry, that was pretty interesting to me. So talk about all that and more. So definitely stay tuned for that. As always, check out my stuff. Go to austinrwilson.com to find my fiction, my publishing credits. You can contact me for the show. I'm currently writing and publishing a story called Dynasty of Blood. 3 volumes of that are up. And right now you can actually order a print version of the first volume through my website. There will be a button right at the beginning, right at the top of the website. So go there, check that out. Let me know what you think about it. Like, subscribe, review the show, share it with people that you think will enjoy it. That is a giant, giant way to help the show. I am already in the process of getting more interviews. So far, this year's been great for people that I've gotten to talk to, and I hope to continue that. But as for right now, this is my chat with Rana Tahir. So you're a poet. You got your MFA at Pacific University, and you wrote a textbook about Harlem Renaissance poet Countee Cullen. So how exactly did you end up writing 2 Choose Your Own Adventure novels? That I would love to know the connection, the path that you took to get there.
You know, the writing world is so small in many ways. And so actually, the way I wrote that textbook is similar to how I ended up writing Choose Your Own Adventure. A friend of mine worked at Cavendish Square, and they were looking for new writers, so she threw in my name, and then they reached out, and that's how I got the Countee Cullen book, which I loved doing. That was my first work for hire book ever. It's my first published book in general. And then years later, I was just leaving my job as a teacher. I used to be a middle school teacher, English language arts. And a teacher of mine from high school who I kept in touch with over the years, Catherine Factor, she got back in touch with me when I moved back to Portland because she's here as well. And then Choose Your Own Adventure were looking for writers. And so she dropped my name, and then I did like this whole audition process. And that's how it happened. It was just, people who know me, unbeknownst to me, were, spreading my name around, which was really nice.
That is super nice. So let's talk about a couple things in there. Let's talk about the audition process first. I'm super curious what that's like. Is it the same as other publishers where it's like, okay, submit us a proposal, give us your book pitch, give us a certain number of pages, or is it completely different for a book that's going to be Choose Your Own Adventure?
Yeah. So for Choose Your Own Adventure specifically, it was the premise of the books were their idea. So the publisher had already said, like, we have the spy series, we would like to do one on, here's a list of names, of people we're considering for the series. And is there one that you're interested in? And so I was already a fan of the person, Noor Inayat Khan, going into this. So I was like, oh yeah, I would love to write a book based on her. Like, she's so cool, and inspirational. And so the audition process was, the first part was I had to send in some sample writing. And then after the sample writing, then they got back to me and they were like, okay, you've passed like this first part. Now what we'd like to do is we'd like to get an outline from you of what the book would potentially be like. And the outlines for Choose Your Own Adventure are basically every choice that is made and how it branches into every ending. So you're basically outlining the whole book. So I did that, and then we workshopped back and forth. They came back to me with some of my choices were like too generic or too like go left or go right. Whereas they want choices to really be meaningful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So things like that, and then eventually they were like, okay, like here's someone we can work with. Who's open to feedback, and we like her writing. So like, yeah, do you want the contract? And so I was like, yeah, sign me up.
That's so interesting. So I watched your presentation on a show called Books with a Past, where you were talking specifically about doing there's a spreadsheet. You show a spreadsheet of like all of these different choices, and it made me like sweat. Like I'm like this cold sweat because I'm like, oh my gosh, this is, because that's my interest. I've obviously been reading Choose Your Own Adventure. Well, maybe not obviously. I've been reading Choose Your Own Adventure novels since I was young, and they're really important to me because they were a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
And the more that I got into writing, and the more that stuff became like the craft of it came to the forefront of my mind, when I started thinking of Choose Your Own Adventure novels, those branching narratives where you're controlling what happens, I just became so obsessed with the idea of how you sit down to write it. And in that video, which I'm going to link in the show notes on Books with the Past,
Mm-hmm.
you talk about writing like a page at a time. Because for anyone who hasn't read a Choose Your Own Adventure book, you get to the end of the page and you have to make a choice. Or sometimes it'll be like turn to the next page, but one of those pages is going to be like, you're either going to do this or you're going to do this. Talk to me about the writing process of actually sitting down to write. Like, are you writing it front to back? Like, how are you sitting down with a page in front of you? Because, normally, you're sitting down there with a blank page and you just keep writing. How's it work for Choose Your Own Adventure?
Yeah, I mean, every writer has their own process. For me, what worked is I'm very into comic books, and so like writing a Choose Your Own Adventure is really like writing a multiverse, right? Like you would see in not exactly the same because it's branching off. Like it's not like in you have Justice League and then the Justice Society, which is like the authoritarian version of the Justice League members, things like that. So it's not like so divergent. You still have to have the core of the character consistent. But what was helpful for me was to write each timeline. So the reason I had that spreadsheet that you're talking about was it show me which choice would go to which until it went to the end. And so I would write that whole thread. And then I would go back a little, read through it. There was a lot of rereading. So read through it again and then write, okay, so I went to this ending first. Let's go back to the previous choice and now write that ending. And then go backwards to the previous choice and write that other branch. And so, it was like one thread at a time. And you're rereading constantly because you want to make sure that things are consistent for the reader.
Sure.
Right? Like if you went down this path and in this choice, you're holding a banana, but all of a sudden next scene you don't have that banana anymore, or something like that. It will pull out the reader, right?
Yeah.
So those are like, it is one page at a time, and then it's also like writing several novels at a time. So you're like, here's the first novel with this ending, here's the second novel with that ending, here's the third novel.
So how, just from an organizational standpoint, like how's that work? Like, are you in one file? Like, are you like you open up? I work in Scrivener, but a lot of people
I love
work.
Scrivener.
Isn't it amazing? I love it.
Mm-hmm.
So, did you write this and like write these in Scrivener, where you're like, let's say you have a folder and it's like timeline 1, and then you switch to another one for a different timeline, or how do you even organize the pages?
Yeah. So when ChooseCo likes their manuscripts all in one like document, so you can't just send them like a bunch of
Yeah.
things. But like the way that I didn't have Scrivener back then, and
Oh.
I think it would have been really cool to have Scrivener. It would have made such a difference.
Yeah.
But what I did was basically every choice had like a page number,
Okay.
and it wasn't the final page numbers. Like I knew things could be moved around or things like that. But it was basically, okay, I've written pages, like in the Noor book, I think it's about 3 pages or so before you get to the first choice. So I've written the first 3 pages, and now I have these choices. So now I have to choose whichever line I'm going through, and then chronologically, again, go through those next few pages until I get to the next choice, and on and on. And the way that I did that was I just had it in one document. So I would do like turn to page, blah, blah. And because I had that outline with the page numbers already inserted, it was easy for me to navigate. And like control find was like my
Sure.
help,
Oh yeah.
like control find page. And like you put a header on each page that says page 12 or page whatever, it's not actual page numbers. I think with the Noor book, I ended up I wrote like double what I was supposed to because there's a word count, and I
Yeah.
did not pay attention. I was just having so much fun with the project. You're like just going, oh, these weird, like there's so many timelines that didn't make it into the final product that I still am like, oh man.
Yeah.
But it's like it's kind of, I would say, and I'm working on some novels, like traditionally structured novels. And to me, that was a lot harder because with Choose Your Own Adventure, you get to the end of the story in like just a few pages. Like if you actually took one timeline out and made it its own standalone thing, it would probably be around 20 pages,
Right.
at most. But it feels like so much more because there's all these different aspects that you're writing. Yeah, it's just, but yeah, I think once you have that outline and where you're going, that helps. My other writing, I don't necessarily always use outlines, so I'm like kind of flying by the seat of my pants. Um, so it's harder to get anywhere. Whereas this, because I had that outline of like, okay, this choice leads to this choice, which leads to that choice, it was easy to follow. And as long as I labeled things, it was fine.
So, what do you think it was about your writing, or maybe even just you as a person, where they were like, you said it was your high school teacher who was like, oh yeah,
Mhm.
she could write a choose your own adventure novel. What do you think? What do you think made it seem like that was something that would be perfect for you?
I don't know. Catherine was, so I went to the Interlochen Arts Academy, which is a boarding arts school in Michigan. And Catherine's also an alum of that school. And then she came back to teach for a semester, and that's where I met her. And I was in her fiction workshop, and it was, like, I remember like being really impressed with her, and like I think that's part of why we stayed in touch. In fact, she was the person who first told me of about this undergraduate program that I ended up applying to, and that's where I met my husband. Like it's weird, this small world thing. Uh, but I'm not sure what she saw in my writing specifically. But I think with Choose Co in general, I think mostly it was that I understood the concept of like the multiple channels and the multiple endings and stuff, and how you really want it to be, I mean, you want those choices to be tough for the reader. You want the reader to open the book and be like, oh no, I really want to do this because I think this might happen, but also maybe this one is the right answer, and like to have real consequences each time you make a choice. Um, so I think that understanding was pivotal. Like it couldn't just be a go this way, go that way.
So that was I kept thinking about it as I was and the Stranger Things Choose Your Own Adventure one, which is called Heroes and Monsters, as I was reading that, and then reading about your other work, your poetry, and I started getting really kind of obsessed with this idea of reader agency and how do you focus on writing a choose your own adventure novel, or really anything like, the other fiction that you're working on. Although I do want to ask how it would connect with poetry. We'll get to that in a second. But just like balancing between making the reader feel that they are participating instead of just viewing, or especially with your SPIES book about Noor Inayat Khan. And then also the Stranger Things book is set in a season that was out on Netflix. So how did you focus on making the reader feel where those choices, like obviously you're talking about the choices having consequences, but from a writing standpoint, how are you focusing on making them feel like a participant other than just a viewer?
Yeah. I mean, with Choose Your Own Adventure, it's sort of built into the style of book. Like you have to make the choice in order to move on in the story. So in that way, it's helpful. Like it's a little easier to get that buy-in from the reader. But I think also the main thing is like, and I learned this much more with the Stranger Things book, just because. So when I had started that book, I got the scripts before the show came out, like before the trailers are even dropped.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, I had to like sign an NDA and all this stuff, like can't leak anything. So I was reading through the scripts and I was a fan of the show as well. So like I had already seen the first 3 seasons and was familiar with the characters and stuff. So what I really focused on in reading the scripts, and then turning that into the Choose Your Own Adventure book was I wanted everything to feel like the characters, right? So that a fan of the show, when they read, Dustin in the book, he feels like Dustin in the show. Like the choices that you make and the way he reacts to them feels realistic to like if Dustin was a real person in the world, this is how he would react to it. And I think that's really the main way, like in any kind of writing, if you can get the psychology of the character, if you can make that plain to the reader and like they feel like they understand the character, then they feel more. It's kind of like fan fiction in a way, and like I know fan fiction has like a reputation to some people. I love fan fiction, but yeah, there's definitely like you can tell the good fan fiction is like comes from the people who really love the material and really spent time, like they know that character so well and inside out, and so you enjoy the story because it's like a new perspective, but it's still that same character, it's still that same world, versus like you'll have other fan fiction where it's like it's clearly you like, not to like mess things up, but like there's a lot of Harry Styles fanfic. There's like
yes,
so much of it, but and like he's a real person, but like let's pretend for a second that he's just a character from a book,
sure,
right? Every single Harry Styles fan fiction has a different, like it's not Harry, it's
right?
Like it's just or like speaking of Harry's, like Harry Potter fan fiction. Like I see some like I love My Immortal. I don't know if you remember that. It was and I like some of my favorite things come out of that. It was so ridiculous. Like I'm not saying it was good fan fiction, but it was so bad it was enjoyable. But it's so clear, like the Draco Malfoy and the Harry Potter of those, like they're not Draco and they're just the skins. It's like some other character wearing the skin of this character. But like I feel like that's true for any fiction is what and I do think writing fanfic is a very good way to teach yourself some fundamentals of writing. But it's like the books that I really, really loved, not just Choose Your Own Adventure books, but just books in general that I really loved, I feel like I know the characters, like they're real people to me. And I think that's what brings in the buy-in. Or like when we get things like, I think part of the reason Game of Thrones became so big was because there was a lot of meat to unpack there. Like people would argue like, oh no, this is like, Jamie wouldn't do that. He's moved on. He's grown as a character. How could he revert to the, like, we have opinions on their lives because we feel like we really know them and care about them and can understand them. And so then when they do things that we either agree or disagree with, we're grappling with that like we would a friend doing something that we're like, I'm not sure how I feel about that, or yay, go you.
See, that's such an interesting comparison because your first Choose Your Own Adventure book is about a real person, someone who very literally lived, and then your second one is about a bunch of people who aren't real. Did that feel different writing? Did it feel the exact same writing both of those books, or was it easy to separate where you're not worried? Like, were you worried because the first, she was a real person? So was there a sense of like fear to getting it right?
Yeah, I think with Noor specifically, I think it's easier to write about made up people, right? To a certain extent, there's not really, I mean, because it was a show, I did feel that responsibility towards fans, so that it still was within the integrity of the show. Um, but with Noor as a real person, and also as a person that I look up to, um, just for various things, I'm a Muslim woman, she's a Muslim woman. Third culture kid is how I would describe her and her upbringing, same as me. Um, all these things, like I identified with her very much. And then also she's, it's a World War II book. There's so much going on in terms of just the politics, the genocide, the Holocaust going on, right? So I felt like a much bigger responsibility to understand her as a person as well as I could from the research that I did. And then also make sure that, I lived up to sort of the civic responsibility of like really showing what are the things that she cared about? Why was it important to her? This person who had no reason to go back into France, no reason to join the war effort, like as a woman, a minority, like the cultural expectation of the time was that she didn't have to go off and die in a war, but she chose to. So making that apparent to the reader, why would she choose that, right? And ultimately, in reading about her and researching, what I found was like we have this person who is very empathetic, and that empathy also sort of feeds into her ideas of justice. So it's not just that she was content with being against the injustice that was happening, but that she felt in her bones like this drive, like I have to be there, I have to do something, I can't just watch from the sidelines, you know. And so once I distilled it to those two things, it was easier to write about her. But before that, before I really got that distillation down, I was like, oh, well, how do I incorporate like this part of her personality or that part of her personality or this story? So like I had to focus on those important things, and then everything else was like Easter eggs. So like if you know the story of Noor Inayat Khan, you'll know, like you'll see certain references in the book and you'll be like, oh, I know where that's from. Like at one point I have, I think this is the timeline where you choose to go to Belgium, and this spy who secretly is actually a Nazi sympathizer and is tricking you, right? He calls her Bang Away Lulu, which was her nickname when she was in training, because she apparently, when she would, type in her messages, she was like banging really hard on the machine. And so like things like that, I was like, okay, is this important? No. Is it a fun Easter egg? Yes. And that's how I started treating those aspects about her. And then it really helped more so in the alternate timeline where she goes to India, right? So the first choice in the book is you either go on the European track or the Indian track. And because that is entirely made up, right? She didn't live that life. But it was like, okay, let me take the things about her that I know that are integral to this character and see what would she do in this. And then in that scenario, no, there's like a family thing, but there's also a political thing because it's the Quit India movement is happening at the same time, and there's actually one of the storylines I had that didn't make it to the book was during the Quit India movement and during World War II, the majority of foreign soldiers were soldiers from British India, right? And so a lot of Indians at the time were like, okay, we're fighting for the freedom of these people in this continent that's away, and we don't have our freedom here, right? So there's that disconnect, and having her sort of deal with that. And then there was a historical figure whose name escapes me now, but he actually sided with the Nazis in India. He was like, okay, the British are our enemy. They're the ones subjugating us. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and I had, it didn't make the book, but I was really interested in this, like, okay, well, how would Noor, deal with this, where she has seen, like, she had to flee from Nazi violence. That's why she left France in the first place.
Right.
Right. And then she comes to this other place where they're also fighting for freedom, but this time like one of them is like sympathetic. What does that mean? How do you deal with that? And that part was really interesting to me because, again, it was like putting this character, this person I know who has these fundamental beliefs, and sort of challenging them. So like the big thing with Noor was she was a pacifist in real life, right? That was how she was raised. That's what she believed in. But then she also voluntarily went to war, and I thought that was such an interesting dichotomy that I was like, okay, this is the crux of the book. Anywhere she goes, there's going to be conflict, and how does she deal with it?
Well, that complexity too of going to the country where the good guys, quote unquote, are oppressing a culture, and like, did it get cut because of how complex it was, or was it a time, like a space issue? Because that's like super layered and hard to figure out, like, what's right. Like, that's
Yeah.
so interesting.
It was definitely a space issue. I think what I did, and I was still very new to, like, work for hire writing, which is what this is, right? I don't own the rights to these
Right.
books or anything like that. But in the first book, it was very easy to just be like, oh yeah, I wrote too much. Editor, please help. And my editor, Melissa, she went and cut it up for me. And I was like, I agree with whatever cuts you made, like, we're good. Like, there were, because, some things they were interesting ideas, but I don't know if they were interesting in the format of choose your own adventure. Like, it is interesting to think about the different factions within India at the time, or like the subcontinent at the time, and how they were responding to World War II and the imperialism at home, right? But it was like, is that really for the reader, or is that more just for me?
Right. Right.
Like,
yeah.
like,
So what's the typical age range they're trying to have you produce choose your own adventure books for? I know that there's a sort of a curve depending on some of the books. What was the range for you for your two?
So it was middle grade, is how it'd be categorized. I would say, like, my ideal middle part was like an 11-year-old. I was thinking of an 11-year-old just because, as a former middle school teacher, that is the time in a kid's life where they're really sort of becoming their own person, those tween teen years. It's no longer I do what my parents say, or I think what my parents think, but it's like I'm starting to get my own ideas.
Right.
So that was my, like, my focus is like, okay, this is at an 11-year-old's level, hopefully, and then, advanced readers who are younger will enjoy it, and then readers who are older hopefully will just enjoy the story.
With the Stranger Things book, did you have any sort of guidance as far as like changing the story or having characters end up in places that they don't in the TV show? Or was it essentially sort of hands off, where they were like, obviously, you having respect for the characters and wanting to have them be the people that us, the viewers, know them to be, is important. So that seems like they maybe would have given you the freedom, but I don't know. Was there any guidance as far as what you could or couldn't do?
Not directly. I think the main thing was like I couldn't make up things that were so out of left field, right? Like I couldn't make it so that like Mike all of a sudden has powers just like 11 or something
Right.
like that. So that was the only guidance that I was given, and then it was more like in the revision process, when Penguin Random House's editors would read the stuff, and because they have the rights to the books, um, they would check in and be like, oh, actually, there's this really funny thing. So I'm 5'2". This is relevant.
Okay.
Um, and so as I was writing the book, the you character doesn't know all these characters. Like we as readers know them because we've watched the show, but the you character doesn't. So I had to find ways of describing these characters before the you learns their names and stuff. And I was consistently going, the tall girl, the tall girl. And I was thinking of Robin, and the actress is only 5'8". But to me, I was like, that's tall.
She's tall.
Yeah. And actually one of the editors is like, you keep using this, like, why tall? And that was a really funny, like, moment of like, oh yeah, that's my bias right there. So like there were things that like little cues or things, but I think mostly because I loved the show and I wanted to do right by it, and I really wanted this to be sort of fun for the fandom.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my goal going into it, was like, I want fans to read this and be like, oh man, this was fun, you know? So I think they didn't have as many critiques and changes as they might have otherwise. But yeah, there weren't many restrictions. I think the hardest thing was coming up with different things for the characters to do, especially because, as you watch each season, Stranger Things is very tightly written. The way the stories go, you can kind of predict to a certain extent in some ways, and then they throw like the curveballs and stuff, which is really fun. But the curveballs always make sense as well, which is something I love. It's not just jumping the shark. It's like this came in, and you can see like, oh man, they were planning this.
Yep.
I have so many theories of season 5. I don't have any intel of season 5. Just want to make that clear.
Even if you did, I figured if they did give you the scripts, it was one of my questions. I was like, if they did give her the script, she had to sign an NDA. And if she knows anything at all, she's not going to be able to say anything legally. So, but well, as a fan, because I saw the book when I was at Target, and I promise I didn't plan this. I was literally buying this Vecna Funko Pop that's sitting behind me the day I bought your book.
Wow.
Because I'm also a big fan of the show. And I think you did exactly what you set out to do. I had a ton of fun with it, and the characters really hue with who they are in the show. And it was fun. Like I had a ton of fun, and I'm so curious. Another thing I saw you say about writing, specifically the choose your own adventure stuff, is if you wrote it first person, going back to change all of those things to second person. So for anyone who doesn't know, it's you. It came out of a book called, I think it was The Adventure of You, which is where it all started, and then became Choose Your Own Adventure. Mm-hmm. Was that weird to get into the habit of writing you, or did it come naturally?
It was very weird the first time. Yeah. It's funny. So my poetry is very much centered in first person, very introspective. And then my fiction, especially when I write science fiction and fantasy, and that's all very third person, like he, she, and so it's like, obviously, as someone who studied writing, I've studied second person, but I never actually felt like drawn to like writing specifically in second person. And so that was really hard. Like one of the things I eventually had to let go of, because, and I think people who read my choose your own adventure work and then versus the poetry, they'll see like there's such a huge stylistic difference. And for a while I was like, I want this to sound like my poetry. But there were two problems. One was just the time constraints, like the schedule that I was given. Like there was no way that I could do that. I mean, I've been working on the same novels, the ones that I'm personally working on, for like over a decade, and they're still not close to be done. being done. But like with a deadline, I was like, okay, I have to get this done.
Right.
So like they sound different. And then also I was like, the repetition of the word you just started grating at me. Like I was like, how many ways can I say you did this or you did that? And so it was difficult. And I think eventually I just had to make my peace with like, it's the nature of the beast. This is just how it goes. Like just try to make it as good as I can at the time.
One of the things that I find myself, that thing that I'm like, I have to just make peace with this for some reason. And it's just on the, like when I'm writing on the page, if there is a word that is the same as the word beneath it, like the above and below in the line, I get so hung up on it sometimes that I'm like, just shut up and move on. Like, it's just, it's not going to be like this. If it gets to print, like move past it, but it will stick out to me and I'll get stuck on it sometimes. Yeah. The you thing, I was so interested so did you have to go back and change?
I did. Yeah. There was a significant, like, it's funny with the rewriting, it was less rewriting the storylines and the structure, and it was more rewriting on the sentence level, like just things that just sounded clunky or were a little confusing. There were also things like, because Choose Your Own Adventure is generally for middle grade readers, sometimes I would use language and stuff that I would use in my normal writing, which is, I guess, geared more towards an adult audience. And then I'd be like, okay, no, wait, I'm writing for kids. Let me not, I don't want to say dumb it down, because I think kids generally rise to the occasion if they're interested.
Yeah.
But I also was like, how can I say this in a way that I'm giving the same content, but in more accessible language?
That's an interesting challenge. And fun too. Mm-hmm. A big thing that I was thinking about, especially after reading some of your poetry and the Choose Your Own Adventure stuff, is, and especially after the thing you said at the beginning of the interview where you would write just one timeline and then sort of move on to the next timeline, is beginning, middles, and ends. And I started sort of thinking about each page in a Choose Your Own Adventure book as being this like beginning, middle, and end, and then all of those things adding up. And I'm really curious how that structure, the like classic story structure, beginning, middle, and end, applies to poetry, or maybe specifically your poetry. And I don't know that I've ever thought of whether poems have middles or maybe even just like logistical middles, but like, does that apply to poetry as you're writing it at all?
I mean, I think so. I think, so just like if we think of fiction and the traditional like story arc, you have your exposition, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, all that. Right. That's a structure that you can play around with, right? That's how we get terms like cliffhangers, where you end right after the climax or something like that. Poetry has, to me, a narrative, and I'm putting air quotes around narrative, but it's not necessarily plot. And I think that's the thing, right? So, for example, I usually have, when I'm writing poetry, I'll usually have like the beginning and the end pretty much clear in my mind. And it's all the middle stuff that I'm like, which is funny. I mean, that's how my novel writing is too. It's like, I know the beginning and I know the end, how to get there.
How do I get there?
Yeah. But, with poetry, you have both like horizontal movement you can have, which I would call like narrative movement, but then you also have vertical movement. So that's like the ideas, the images and motifs and how they come back or get subverted, and it's very hard to do in a short poem, right? Because you have much less real estate. But in terms of structure, it really is, I think it does work the same way, in that you have to have progression. It can't feel like the same. If it's just the same idea, line after line after line, like it gets repetitive, it gets boring, the reader checks out. And it's just not close to the truth of whatever it is you're trying to write about. So there is narrative poetry and I used to write more narrative poetry. I used to hate poetry. That's the funny thing. It's like,
oh, really? For listeners, make sure you go to the website I've linked in the show notes to see how much poetry you've written and published. How did this happen?
It's so funny. Like I think part of it was also I just didn't understand poetry. And for the longest time, I had great teachers before I went to my fancy art school, I had great teachers who instilled the love of writing in me. But the poetry units were, and I'm sure a lot of people hearing this will like identify it. Like they felt like a box we had to check. Like, okay, we did the poetry month. We're done now.
Yep.
And it,
Next Shakespeare.
yeah, yeah. And it's just, it felt very perfunctory. I don't think I understood it very well. And so I hated it. I just absolutely hated it. And even when I applied to the arts school, you have to send them writing in all three genres, so fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. And so fiction, nonfiction, I was like, good, I got this, I got that. My poetry, I waited till the day of before I had to send it in, because I was like, I know for a fact I did not get into that school on my poetry. Like there was literally one poem that, because I just needed three things. I just needed to get them out there. The first line was breathe, and then in, out, in, out. And that was the poem. Like, like I was so not there at all. And then it was when I went to that school, I had some great teachers, like Teresa Scullin, who's a writer in Michigan, and she's a poet herself. And she really did like the intro. I took her intro to poetry class at Interlochen. All students were mandated to have poetry workshop and a prose, like fiction workshop, and then you could take nonfiction as an elective. And she really opened it up for me and like made me understand it in a way. And what I used to write were prose poems. That's how I first started. I was like, I was very comfortable in prose. So I started using some techniques of poetry, but mostly in prose poems that were really like letters to different people.
Yeah.
And then from there, just started sort of whittling away at the traditional narrative, like the beginning, middle, end kind of thing. And started just going with, poetry can be image based, right? The whole thing is just centering around an image, and through that image, you convey the meaning that you're trying to, set for the reader. So like so narrative and poetry, getting back to the point, is like they can naturally go together. I think that when I really started to understand poetry and really enjoy it, I sort of stepped away from narrative and more into lyrical and imagistic poetry. Lyrical really is the main thing. Like it's just in prose, it's the smallest unit is a sentence. You can go sentence by sentence. In poetry, it's a word. You have to go word by word to really revise and change things. And I think you can do that in prose. It's just because there are so many words, it takes much longer.
A lot of time.
Yeah. But that's my goal actually I think that's why none of my novels that I'm working on are ever going to be finished, because I'm like,
you're just going word by word.
Yeah.
Well, so how often are you working on them? Do you still, like, if you're going to sit down to write, are you going to do it every single day? How long? This stuff always interests me. I don't know if it interests the listeners or not. I'm just so curious if people write every single day.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely know writers who write every single day. I am not one of those people. I tried it for a very long time. And I have in one of my notebooks, I write in a notebook. I still write by hand. And then I'll flip through afterwards and see like, okay, is something I can work with or not work with. And I saw on one page, it said, "Oh my God, say anything." And that was during a period where I was trying to write every day.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work for me. And for a while I was very insecure about that, because I think the message, especially in traditional writing programs, is like, if you're not writing every day, you're not a writer. And I found that to be bullshit, basically, because when I was writing every day, all I was doing was producing crap, like it didn't feel right. Whereas what I've learned since then about myself is like, I very much work in projects, and actually this is true even of like my eating habits and sleeping habits. I'm very seasonal as a person. So like I will go through, here's my season of fiction, here's my season of poetry, here's my season of nonfiction. And so I've just learned to sort of run with that. I mean, on the practical level, it doesn't work in terms of getting my work out there. Like I will say, for people who do go to my website and see how many poems I've had published in places, note the dates of when those things were published and how close together they are. And the only reason is because I hired someone, a friend of mine, Sarah, who's fantastic. She's a poet herself. But I hired her to do my submissions for me because I'm terrible at them. Which, pro tip, if you can do that, do that. Because like submissions is a numbers game. You got to get,
it's exhausting.
And it's draining. It is. And I'm just not cut out for it because like half the time I'm not in the mood to sit down and do it. Like, again, I never have a season of, oh, this is when I will submit. That never comes.
Seriously, last week, maybe, I sent a project to an agent, and afterward, I felt like somebody beat the crap out of me. Absolutely beat the crap out of me. I was exhausted, and there was a part of me that was like, why are you acting like this? And I'm like, I'm not acting. This is not acting.
No, it's how I just, the business of writing is just not, again, it's necessary. I understand why it's part of thing. That's how you get your work out there. You have to do it. But man, it's draining and I hate it. Yep. And sometimes I kind of wish, like way back in the day before writers were celebrities, when it was just like, you didn't even know who wrote the thing. You just like read their work like that. I feel like as long as I get, paid for my work, that would be the ideal.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is I think there's a big difference in talking about like writing on and off deadline, because if you have a deadline, it's a lot easier to write every day.
Yeah.
You don't have a choice. I mean, you can, blow the deadline and maybe blow the contract too. But if I have to sit down and crank words out and I'm on deadline, like, okay, well, I'll do that. But off of deadline, I'm very curious about your own writing stuff that doesn't have a deadline. And on those days where you're like, either the words aren't coming or like you said, you're seasonal, like maybe you're not in the season. How easy is it to put something aside for you? One of your novels, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I think I need distance from my work. I think that's why I have this, even with my poetry, this process of writing in a notebook and then, I can always turn the page. And like, actually this summer I'm working on, I did mention this, I think, like I'm working on that first collection of poems, which, hopefully, fingers crossed, I actually get done. We'll see.
Yeah.
But what I realized, and actually, funny enough, I'm using Scrivener for this. Yes. I imported all of my standalone poems that were all Word doc, and then I have a bunch in my notebook that I need to type up. That's usually my first form of revision, is moving from the handwritten to the typed version of things. And then what I'm going to do is put all these poems in one place and see what speaks to each other. I had this having writing friends to talk to is so great.
Big deal.
I had I write in projects. So I had 3 different projects that I was working on that were all poetry projects. And I was talking to my friend Zui Duan, who's a poet, and I was just telling him like, yeah, I have this project here and that project here and this project, and he was like, what if you combine them? And I was like, what? Because I, in the course of our discussion, I kept saying like, I have all these different projects, but each of those individual projects don't have enough poems to create a collection, right? And so he was like, okay, well, what happens if you put them together? And then I was like, oh my God, Zui, you're a genius. Because now that's basically what I'm working on this summer, is taking those 3. There's this series on mermaids that, I take the story of the Little Mermaid and talk about my immigration journey. There's this, not really like the fall of Eden, but like this thing where it's like God and Satan, which is basically like my relationship with my parents and my upbringing and things like that. And then I had this other thing that's also talking about my upbringing. And I realized that there were certain poems that they were speaking to each other. So they could actually be a collection together. So that's really, in terms of my non-deadline writing, it's like I have this idea for a project. I will write in sprints. Like when I'm in the mood to write, I write a lot and then I rest for a significant period of time. But then, once I rest, I'm kind of out of that state where I was writing the thing. So it always feels hard to go back to it. So then I just move on to the next project. And I think knowing that about myself was very helpful in like sort of tamping down the negative, oh, you don't write every day.
Yep.
But then also seeing that I can connect them and bring them together. That's been great because now I feel like maybe I will actually finish this. Maybe I won't need Choose Co to give me a deadline. I will actually be able to finish something on my own.
Well, I mean, that fighting against those negative thoughts or that negativity, I fought with it for a real long time. The shame that I couldn't do it because I wasn't doing it every day. And a lot of it, like you said, is bullshit because it's coming from people who are either saying it in a way that makes it sound like it's the only way to write, or realistically, old dudes who are just like, if you don't write every day, you're not a pro. And it's like, if that works, cool, but it doesn't work for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like sustainability in your writing life is such a huge topic that doesn't necessarily get covered enough.
Yeah.
Because yeah, it is that sort of, not to say that it's a lie, because like the people who preach it, oftentimes they are people who really, it does work for them, and it's
Right.
great that it works for them. But like, it just doesn't, again, like I keep thinking of that little page in my notebook. Oh my God, say anything. Like, come on.
Well, also and I've talked with other guests about this too, the idea of like letting one thing consume me to the point where I'm just like one thing. And I don't know if that's my anxiety, which is, abundant, or if that's just thinking about it the wrong way. Because I never, like, I want people to be complex and have the freedom to be all these different things. And I just always get scared of someone being like, I'm a writer. And then that's all they want to say about themselves.
Yeah.
But maybe that's a me problem more than a writer problem.
Personally, I'm always like, I'm giving a little side eye to the person who's like, I'm a writer and that's it. I'm like, that's not true. Like, no one is just a writer. Like, you have relationships with other people. More likely than not, you have a day job, you have like a bunch of interests and things. Like, to me, and this is funny, I've been thinking about this more and more, and we don't have to get into it, but like this idea of like the failed artist to fascist pipeline, like, and my theory of it, like, in history and even in modern day, we can find like so many people who first start out like they wanted to be an artist or something, and then they don't do well in that, and then all of a sudden they become like, a fascist leader.
Yeah.
And to me, like, the threads of that are from like the people who are like, I'm a writer, or like and again, I love writing, I love writers, I'm not trying to knock anyone, but when I get into a room of writers and everyone's like, oh my God, we're all writers, isn't that amazing? I'm like, yeah, we're also all people, we're also all like, it just, to me, it feels like writing is not my identity.
Yeah.
And I think when writing becomes your identity, that's dangerous. And that's what leads to like the whole, like, because if it doesn't work out and you don't have any, like it, then, there's the resentment, there's the entitlement, there's the feeling like somebody stole something from you. And that's like straight into fascism, because that's what fascists do, right? Like, they're just like, how dare these other lesser people take this thing that was meant for me? So I'm just like,
that feeling that you like deserve your work to be seen, or that doing the work somehow means that you're guaranteed its reception, or like, I've talked about this a lot with one of my best friends who is also an artist and works in creative fields, and the idea that you have to be okay with putting the work in and it maybe not succeeding still.
Yeah.
And that is, as a younger person, I think I struggled with that a lot, but I think now it's like, I mean, if it doesn't, then I'm going to play games with my friends and go watch movies with my wife, and everything's going to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but that's entirely it, right? It's the thing you love and you're passionate about it, but it's not your identity. It's not all of who you are.
Yeah.
And it takes the pressure off too, right? Because I was the same way. I was a very type A student, I was like top marks in class and I'm going to work so hard. And do everything right. And like, I mean, I had like lofty goals about like, oh, when I'm going to get my first poetry collection out and all these things, like, and it didn't work out for me. I'm behind on the schedule that I had for myself as a younger person, way behind.
Yeah.
But it at a certain point I realized like, okay, is the publishing for me or is it for somebody else? Because do I, like, when I first started getting into writing, was I really thinking, oh, I'm going to publish and I'm going to do interviews and blah, blah. No, I was thinking, this is a cool story and I'm
Yep.
enjoying writing it. And that's really the thing that I've been sort of focusing on is publishing is for the world. Writing is for me. And what is it that I'm going to value more? And I'm going to value the writing more. And if, like these novels, I don't really have any intent to get them published anywhere. I don't even know if they're publishable, frankly. I'm not concerned with that as I'm writing. I just like these characters. I like the world building and I'm exploring it and letting it go wherever it goes. I mean, I used to do NaNoWriMo for a while. Yeah, right. And I remember one year the only year I had actually finished NaNoWriMo because I forced myself to get through it. And, because it's the accolade. It's not publishing, but it feels like publishing where it's like, I got it out there. At the end of that month, I looked at all the 50,000 words that I had written. I had to throw it all away. It was terrible. It was just terrible. I was like, I was so busy focusing on that word count, that external validation, that I never actually sat down with the story and like, writing. Again, I don't consider writing. It's part of my identity. It's not my complete identity, but it is precious to me. And I do want to do well at it. And I want to learn the craft as well as I can and improve and grow in that sense. But I'm not competing with anyone else. I'm not really concerned with if it gets published or not. I'm more concerned with, is this the work I wanted to make in the first place? And if it is, awesome. If it's not, then I'm probably doing something wrong.
I think that's a good way to think about it. Thank you very much for coming by. Super awesome talking with you. Direct all my listeners to where they can find you, where they can find your books, anywhere you want to send them. Let's hear it.
Yeah, I guess I'm on Instagram and Twitter. So Instagram, I'm at Reading Rana, all lowercase, and then Twitter at Writing Rana. And yeah, I'm very political. So if you're a person who doesn't like politics, don't follow me on social media, please. Just be very aware of what you're getting into. Otherwise I'm, my website is out there and there's a contact form so anyone can contact me. Yeah.
That's how I got a hold of you.
Yep. It was a very lovely surprise.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to talk with you and super fun.
Yeah, thank you. This was great.
Thank you so much to Rana Tahir for stopping by to chat with me about everything that she does. I have a lot more insight now into how choose your own adventure novels come about, and gosh, I'm still overwhelmed looking at some of that stuff. Super interesting conversation. I was glad she got the chance to chat with me. Go to her website, rana-tahir.com, and check out all of her work. And don't forget to come back and check out the next episode of Ledger. There's another one in the works. I'll talk to you soon.